I'm a Palawa man, a Trawoolway man, from Tebrakunna country, which is in the top northeast of Tasmania. Yeah, so I grew up on Bunurong, Bunurong country, down on the Mornington Peninsula, and I kind of live there now. Yeah. I left high school and went straight into Monash, or Chisholm as it was then, Monash University to do a BA in arts, and I finished that in about 91. And since then I've been making and making art. I did that undergrad in printmaking, so I trained printmaking, and I guess have had a fair eye on the skill. The first 5-10 years were all about skill development and having a really strong handle on that medium. I mainly work with etching and relief, so intaglio and relief. So trying to get that process into my hands and get to know inks, and I did a postgrad up at the ANU finishing in '96, and worked with the wonderful Jörg Schmeiser, who was a pretty important printmaker at the time. And I spent a lot of time. It was at the ANU where I walked around Mount Ainslie every day, and kind of tried to understand landscape away from the perspective of a European framework. So landscape as as something you're engaged in, you're within rather than, and part of, rather than something externalized, I guess. So that was, I'd follow kangaroo trails, I'd follow wallaby trails, and then the mark making that I'd use to describe that walk would not necessarily mimic, but be informed by that movement. Printmaking is all about mark making. So I was trying to make marks that would communicate some of the experience of being within or part of a landscape rather than external to a landscape. I also, and I guess from there, I returned back to the peninsula or returned to the city. And since then I've been practicing art. I guess there was a bit of a disruption for about 10 years where I became an outdoor ed leader. I then became a teacher. I taught art and raised a family. So I kind of had a 10-year sabbatical from making, where I was teaching. I was teaching art making, and I was teaching how we go about making art. And that was a really good thing to do, but there was probably a fair amount of grief there about not practicing, about not being able to survive economically, and wanting to have a family, and therefore having to make economic choices about how I spent my time. But during that time, my wife at the time and I bought a house, and I built a studio, and I created a space in which I could ultimately make work. I raised my boys 50-50, so I was at home half the time, and that allowed me time to build, and kind of set myself up for my 40s. And I guess once I hit my 40s, I then had a bit more space and started pushing towards art. Became involved with Baluch Arts, which was kind of the culmination of a lot of time thinking about my Indigenous heritage, and then rolling on to, I guess, my art practice changing from being of a Western ego-based projection to something a bit more open-minded and community-based, or based on ideas that were complex, right? Or not necessarily related as art with a capital A, but related to culture and cultural practice, and how to engage and interact and translate within the different art world paradigms I found myself in, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, I did some stuff with Koori Heritage Trust. I had a fairly big show with McClellan Sculpture Park, and now find myself up at RMIT. Yeah, the hooded plover empathy suit was essentially a wickerware suit made out of bush poles, I guess, thin pieces of tea tree and what have you, bent, steamed into shape, made into a bodysuit that I could wear. that would turn me into a hooded plover. And the idea was that this was an empathy suit, and trying to reach into being as a hooded plover. So hooded plovers are endangered shorebird, and it was part of an exhibition that was happening at Mornington Peninsula Regional Gallery through the Overwinter project, which is still ongoing now. So the idea being that I put on the suit, I became a hooded plover, and that empathy is just the beginning. To form a relationship, you need some form of engagement beyond beyond just, oh, that's a nice bird. Isn't it a shame it's dying or dying out? You need to put yourself in the position of and try and mimic. As part of the blurb that was on the wall for this work was an invitation to politicians if they wanted me to make an empathy suit for them. I could quite happily make one, so that there was a proposition to make an empathy suit. And that suit, I ran around the beaches of Flinders where the hooded plover lives and got photos taken of that work. And the photos formed a wall, quite a large wall. But I also used one of the photos as a backdrop, so people, and the suit itself was exhibited in front of the backdrop, and you could kind of stand behind or between the backdrop and the empathy suit and pose as a hooded plover yourself in a kind of take a selfie, as a helpful, get a friend to take you as a hooded plover. So there was a kind of interactive process in that. I've also used the suit for performances at Cool Art Wetlands and other places, just as a, kind of running around as a hooded plover, as a disruption to what was expected in a kind of historical garden, a traditional garden for the colonial, a colonial outpost, I guess, from Melbourne. Yeah. So that's one work. The other work I might talk about is the work that's above you, and you'll probably get another shot of that, which is part of my trying to understand what I'm doing here in a PhD. Um, the sticks are gathered from a site on RMIT where one of my direct relatives, but also another man from Tasmania, were hung. So the first two people hung in the colony or the invasion of Victoria were countrymen of mine and kin of me. And the sticks I've gathered from their site of which they were hung. There's a memorial there, and it's a flawed memorial called Standing By. And I guess as a way of centering myself with country, with space, with history, with my family and that continuum, I've collected sticks from that site, and they're coming up all over the place in my work. But they've kind of come to represent, in some ways, they're representing the bones of those men, but also their presence with me now here. It was a way of bringing Tebrakunna country onto this country, and owning this space. And I guess one of the reasons for making it was I was struggling with a lit review and the idea of a lit review. The Lauren Tynan has talked about a lit review being perhaps for Indigenous people something along the lines of a respect protocol. So respecting where your knowledge is coming from and acknowledging that rather than a kind of analytical thing. There's a much in Indigenous academia, if you like, about being alongside knowledge rather than excluding knowledge or having an argument with knowledge. So I guess that this artwork was about me having these multiple threads of thought and understanding binding into a center that has to be centered from my perspective on Mother Earth, on the place that I'm at, that centers all of our country, centers all our thinking. And then on the periphery, I've put tiny little mariner shells, which are kind of representing where I'm from and my tiny journey in amongst these fronds of thought that are out there. And what's nice is the work just spins. So I have it above me in the studio, and it sort of centers me. It allows me to kind of keep in mind why I'm here and what's important about being here, which is that it's beyond me. I'm just occupying a small thread line, and that ultimately I'm trying to um, fulfill some roles or obligation with with community, with culture, and see how I can adapt culture um, to help what what's part of who we are now. Um, so it's a lot of what I'm doing in the doctorate is trying to understand how and what is appropriate to challenge and to rethink um, in cultural practice. What can I use or borrow to do some of that? Yeah. Yeah, I guess it has been a journey. Anybody who's grown up in a family who is not their genetic family always has questions about who they are and what they are. Um, and, I grew up in a loving family, white, middle class family. Um, both parents were educated, grandparents, my grandfather was educated. So, surrounded by those kind of middle class values. Um, I went to a private school, an alternative private school, but a private school all the same. So I had all that advantage, and I passed as white most of the time. Um, so that I was raised in a white space, um, with the advantages and disadvantages that has. But I was always, my skin went fairly brown during winter. So, oh, what's your heritage? It was kind of like speculative fiction. And your origins were always something that was um, questioned. So there was an otherness there as I grew up. I was aware I wasn't the same as those around me, but not quite sure why. Um, I guess when I went and did the graduate diploma um, at the ANU, I became really aware that if I was to live well, I needed to follow my birth family and try and get in touch with them and try and resolve some of those gaps in who I was. And in '96, I met my birth mum, Joan, and learnt some of our family story, our family history. And it's through her that my um, line to Tasmania exists. And I think that wasn't necessarily, I was enthralled and excited to find out about that part of my heritage, but it took some adjusting, and I was really wary of kind of um, projecting myself into a space that maybe not be appropriate, or how could it be appropriate? And I sort of sat with that knowledge, I guess, for uh, 15 years and learnt about Aboriginal culture as much as I could in those years. Um, I've had folk I knew and had chatted at, meetings and where I'd bump into folk. And um, I guess when I turned 40, I had the studio. I was restarting practice, and I was working a lot with images from my Indigenous foremothers and fathers, and I approached an arts organisation, Indigenous arts organisation, sort of saying, "Look, is this appropriate? What I'm doing? Is this okay?" And they were quite welcoming. And essentially, I became part of Bullock Arts, became part of the board, became the chair for a while. Now that organisation went through political change, and there's some lateral violence there, but that was a very nurturing place for me for quite some time, and it was a place that allowed me to recognize the reality and stop denying who I was in some ways, to be able to lean in and um, do that in a comfortable way. And I guess I'm kind of, I'm at the edge of Aboriginality. Um, I occupy a truthful space. I'm really clear about my origins and who I am and where I come from, but there's limits to my cultural authority, the connection to others, has taken sort of 15 years, 30 years from probably finding out from Joan that origins, and that's been a really exciting process to kind of slowly meet up with, you know, folk on the peninsula, um, the arts, the Indigenous arts, artists and art groups, Moraine, which is a gathering place down on the peninsula, um, and then Melathina Tikana Warrana, which is my traditional owner group in Tasmania, and becoming part of them through Auntie Nettie Shaw and a bunch of other people, Di Summers and a bunch of others who've kind of come round and welcomed me home in some ways, and that's been a really nice part of that journey. But it hasn't been easy, and it's not something I entertained lightly. And you know, as anybody stepping into that space, make your mistakes. Probably will still continue to make them. That's okay. But I am um, I respect the generosity and the care people have taken, and also understanding that for many stolen gen, for many lost generations, for many people who can't trace their origins necessarily, you know, that's not an uncommon story through the foster system and the ongoing separation of children from kin and from family. That, you know, that it's not like that's a new process. And while my adoption was a accidental conception and about economics, it wasn't about my birth mum's aboriginality. Um, it's still common part of our story, um, is about children going away and coming back. So it's not without precedent. It's not without honesty or space too. Yeah.
Yeah, fractured. It's a systemically fractured space.
Yeah, and I hope I'm honest enough about that so that I'm not sort of taking on cultural authority I shouldn't, for example, or waiting for that building of of competency or understanding within community. Yeah. Partially it was driven by a job interview to become part of the staff at RMIT. And at the end of the interview, they said, the person who got the job had a doctorate, you don't. Do you want to get a doctorate? So it was an invitation after, I guess, trying to step outside secondary teaching, which is how I've earned and supported my art making habit and my family for the past 20 years, I guess. Um, I guess too, I've got, you know, my youngest is 19, is about to come to RMIT to do engineering next year. You know, he's taken a gap year, so I've kind of getting an empty house. You know, the empty nest. So a compulsion to use that opportunity to push into a new life is part of that. Um, I've been living on the Mornington Peninsula, and I'm really excited to be around the ideas of RMIT and people who are pursuing ideas and thinking hard and deeply about stuff. And just the access to all of that is pretty lovely. So I guess for all those reasons, yeah, moving up to RMIT has been good, really positive. Sure. I'm looking at a way in which I originally started thinking about how can I manage the trauma that's part of country, and or how can I address some of that I kind of feel when I'm in places in Tassie. There's obvious massacre sites, but there are other places where you kind of go, this feels wrong. What's that about? How do we, you know, that responsibility and obligation to heal and manage your own country is part of my cultural obligation. So how can I do that? And I've looked at I came across reference to funerary bags in which ashes and bones and amulets were carried by Trawoolway as a way of sometimes keeping you healthy, sometimes as carrying a friend with you for company, sometimes, as I understand it, a way of processing grief, holding grief and relief of grief. So the hope is that we are able to, either through a paper bag scenario, so a bag that's made out of cultural. So here's an example that I'm kind of trialing or checking out, is a bag made of paper that we can burn. So individuals have put their grief, what represents their grief, inside the bag, and then that would go into a fire and send that grief or trauma up to an ancestors so that they're able to process it on our behalf, and it removes itself from country. That's one of the processes I'm seeing, whether that fits in, whether that's worthy. I've talked incidentally to a couple of different elders from different communities. They've sort of said that might be a way of doing it. Or the other one is making, this is made out of copper, but making a vessel that we all put our grief into and then put that on a fire, so it again burns those things, smokes those things to the ancestors for them to manage up into sky country and beyond. So I am guided by the elders and community in that approach. I'm at that beginning stage of interaction with them about this. You know, I've been talking with them for about 6 months about this as a possibility, but I still need a lot of work and a lot of community work and a lot of community consultation to get in a position. And I'm essentially drafting objects as a proposal. Some of these objects are going to go over to a cultural day so they can be looked at and exhibited with others. You know, there's some aunties making similar vessels, so we're kind of exploring this as a group. The idea is that the artwork is actually completed by others. So really critical to my artwork is a process where the community engages and completes the artwork. It's not an artwork that I will present as a finished object. It's an artwork that I might present in a gallery context on the understanding that they haven't been completed as objects, or their function hasn't been completed until the community engagements run through. So I'm sort of seeing how that kind of community process can engage, and that's part of my methodology, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I mean, it's obviously ongoing. You just have to read Deaths in Custody. You just have to open the news. You need to see how the media portrays Aboriginal people and how it presents our reality in such a negative way. The Yes vote is a classic example, and how that was dominated by an unconscionable way of seeing the world and a cynical way of manipulating media that is horrendous. So there's this ongoing colonial mindset that is part of our everyday. The imperial colonial mindset is embedded in all our institutions and is set up to work. The justice system has recently been described by that wonderful show at Heidi as the injustice system. It's working as intended. It's working to incarcerate mob. You know, the way the structure of the law is set up to incarcerate us, to separate us from our children. The law is working as intended. So that means there's constant grief. There's constant sorrow within community, that people coming really struggle to have a safe life. I just have to wear a t-shirt that decries my Aboriginality down in Rosebud, and I'm getting looks from strangers in the street. And I pass as white most of the time. So it's little wonder. You know, you go, I've been in communities where security guards are following Aboriginal kids around the shops. So the grief is endless and it's ongoing. So it needs to be managed as ongoing. I mean, for Tasmanian people, We're not supposed to exist. You know, we're supposed to be extinct by the myths of colonialism, and I'm still here. You know, so there's this ongoing assertion coming into an institution like this. I need to assert our ways of knowing and being, and present that in a way that is translatable into academic worlds, so that our knowledge systems can be validated. So, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg, let alone the massacre sites and the horrible history of you know, people were hunted for their ears in Tasmania. You know, there was bounties. You know, Batman, for example, one of the founders of Melbourne, was a bounty hunter in Tasmania. You know, he did horrible things during the Black Wars and post-Black Wars, and then hitting Victoria. So there's a historical context, there's a contemporary context, and there's also a projection into the future, a sense of agency that is lost, or a sense of constant pushing and assertion. And I know both sides of that coin. I've grown up in that white world, and I know the blithe ignorance that is part of that community, the assumptions and the hiding away from truth. It appalls me. It saddens me. But I understand it, because it was the world I grew up in. And it's not the world I inhabit now, vehemently. But I'm well aware of it. And people I know, you know, some of those people love me and are ignorant or racist or bigoted. And that's the reality. Yeah. Um, I guess I worry about the word tradition, because it implies something of the past, or something folksy, or something outside everyday practice. The word cultural practice is perhaps how I describe it, because a lot of cultural practice is contemporary practice, um, and the kind of adaptation of tradition is a normal everyday thing of every culture, and that's what's happening in our culture. Um, so I guess one of the tensions I've had often in making is not coming from a place of cultural authority. How can I make in a space? How can I use patterns, or how can I use imagery? And I've tended to go to using traditional materials in a non-traditional way, or using or cultural materials. You know, I fall into the same trap. Cultural materials in a uh, non-traditional way, or non-cultural way. So this is a copper. Copper is an exploitative material. It comes from mining and smelting and huge power uses to create copper. Um, I've used this to mimic possum skin, or kangaroo skin that these pouches were made from. So rather than stepping into a practice that I don't necessarily have the cultural authority to explore, I use materials that are, if you like, part of the Scottish and Irish history and heritage. And it seems an honest way of dealing with some of that. And it creates an object that is right and wrong, if that makes sense. There's a tension in that materiality. And when I use kelp for sails of a ship, or tea tree to create crosses, or make a spear but make the spear so it collapses, I'm using processes in a way that stretch them, that change their meaning, that act as a way of translation, if you like, within the object's cultural intent and its possible place. Um, so yeah, there's a real kind of, and it's tricky. Sometimes I don't get it right, or sometimes I get it right, and it's just to sad. There's objects I've made that I won't show anyone because I'm not sure that they're right. They're too wrong, if that makes sense. There's some objects that hold that tension in balance, and it's in that space that it's helpful. Yeah, so I guess that the tension is held by helpfulness or constructivity rather than a rage or an anger or a frustration or a want to show off, if that makes sense. Yeah. You know, I'm not within the center. I'm being invited in occasionally, but I have to, my practice have to exist on that edge because it's the honest place for me to be. Art doesn't work in dishonesty. As soon as dishonesty comes, it falls apart in hubris. And Indigenous culture is really sensitive to hubris, which is kind of really helpful because it knocks me back on track. People have said, and hopefully will continue to say, not sure about that, or yeah, let me think about that and get back to you, or nah. You know, Daniela Coates, who's doing a PhD, once said, sort of said, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but ethics is when the aunties yell at you. You know, there's a feedback loop, and I must be respectful and thoughtful and understand that feedback loop for its qualities. Yeah, with the different elders I interact with and different communities I interact with. Yeah. I have about 3 or 4 at the moment. So I guess it's an interdisciplinary study, using the kind of academic terms. So it's I'm going to use the metaphor of a workspace. So the ways of Indigenous ways of knowing and being has a lot of foundation within academic writing. That's a bit like the shed I work in or the studio I'm working. That's the space I'm going to occupy. Within that, there's a bench, and that's Indigenous standpoint theory. So working at the bench of in the shed is kind of the way I think about it. You know, that's where I get a lot of work done is looking at it from an Indigenous perspective. I guess some of the tools I've got, some of the screwdrivers and the hammers, are things like decolonisation, and the way that theory works is a bit like a structure I can use to understand my own bigotries, my own growth, my own ways of being. They're a really helpful tool in understanding the context of Aboriginality, but they're not all of it. And praxis is like the techniques. It's the way in which I learn skills or explore ideas. It's, there's this kind of reading and digestion and understanding and sitting with, but it's only when I start using my hands that those ideas are are understood. Making this teaches me about the idea. Without the making, I have no way of resolving those conflicting thoughts or processes. And I'm really early on. I'm like 8 months in. So I'm still in that kind of position where I have no solid understanding of how this will resolve itself. But it's only through the making of the objects, the sharing of the objects, taking the objects to community, having discussions, the yarning protocols, following those through, that actually this may become helpful beyond me. And that, I guess, is that socially engaged art practice discourse, which is the final part. And that's kind of like what I'm making, things that can be used by others, that are only completed by others, so that hopefully my ego withdraws from the artwork and others engage with it to complete the work. I've explored ideas through making. I invite people to engage with the ideas, but only through that engagement have the idea as a kind of valid outcome or a work. And there'll be objects I display in a traditional Western gallery as part of, getting through my doctorate, and that's expected part of the kind of academic framework for making art. But the objects aren't complete until they're made with others. And I hope that the community will embrace part of this as a ritual or as a ceremony or as part of our language for dealing with trauma, rather than it being something I am necessary within. Hopefully that the concept is helpful for others and spreads to other artists and other makers and other communities, and that's part of that larger process of contributing to the river of Black academic study, if that makes sense. Yeah. I do that on the shoulders and backs of others. There are many Black warriors in the academic world who are making our voices and asserting our needs and our knowledge systems and the strength of them. I'm privileged to be part of that. I'm privileged to work with what's happening here, but also, I have communion with people at La Trobe and at Macquarie and at Deakin University. There's this kind of growing swell of folk who are asserting our knowledge systems and our belief systems into the world of knowledge and recognition. So I intend to be part of that in a small way if I can. Um, it's exciting, and it's also tricky. Yeah. There's an endless list, I guess, just from mob people like Julie Goff and Trawoolway people, um, Greg Lehman, Jodie Haynes, um, Lauren Tynan, sorry, are all Black academics doing work who are Trawoolway. They're the same mob as me, and it's amazing. Nika Lehman, is that there's this amazing proliferation of Trawoolway Black academics that are doing great work. So I always admire them. There's the cohort of HDR students I'm with, and they're doing incredible work. Um, I guess that, but it's endless. Marcia Langton's been a hero of mine for a very long time. Those sorts of contexts and people are part, Vicky Cousins with Yungamara, working with Jodie Haynes, incredible stuff. So I'm really interested in how I can contribute, how I can help, how I can motivate, I guess, those obligations, and I guess, um, yeah, I guess create a safer place for others to come into this space. Yeah. I guess the real thing is that I'm building on others. This isn't my own work. This is the work of generations of cultural um, assertion, of fighting, of um, painful, painstaking understanding, comprehension, and thought. And I'm part of that, but I'm only a tiny part. And I guess that's one of the clear things that I'm really humbled by the company around me and excited to be part of what they're doing and contribute in my own way. So yeah, I guess that's the other part of of this is that it's a collective of work, and it goes from education all the way across to the arts, to engineering, to science. It's not just one particular form of thought.